Episode 4, Political Alternatives. In this video, I will reference selections from Aristotle's Politics, Book 3, as translated by Benjamin Jowett. The citation and link can be found in the video description below. In times like this, when it's clear to anyone paying attention that the political order is in critical decline, and feels itself in critical decline to such a degree that it now willingly violates individual rights, seeing as how protecting individual rights is one of the bedrocks of liberal democracy. Nevertheless, it violates them in select cases, granted, but it violates them and does so in the name of security and public safety. In such times, it can be useful to gain perspective on our situation by going back to fundamentals. And this means the fundamentals of politics. Not the fundamentals of the current modernist order, but of politics in general. The current order is just one particular manifestation of politics. To my mind, there's no better person to look at in order to get at political fundamentals in a clear and accessible way than Aristotle. If you read the Politics in Book 1, Aristotle proceeds from the assumption that the purpose of a thing, like politics, is its essence. The purpose is the essence. And the purpose of politics is for men to obtain the good life, which is a life that is self-sufficient and allows for the highest possible development of the human virtues: wisdom, courage, justice, prudence. For Aristotle, the individual is not self-sufficient and cannot develop all the virtues on his own, because one requires language and reason, which are developed only with other people. Persons raised by wolves, for example, do not develop language. And many virtues require interaction with others. You can't really develop justice without interacting with other people. Can't be developed alone. And we reach our highest humanity in the city or state. So when Aristotle says state, he is using the Greek word polis, which refers to it's a larger entity than what we think of as a city. It can be translated as city, but they include the farms and the countryside which surround and supply the city as part of the polis. That word used to be translated as city-state for this reason. It meant city in a much broader sense than we use it. Aristotle famously describes man as zoon politikon, meaning a political animal, which is a stronger claim than the claim that man is naturally social. Most people would agree with that, but Aristotle goes further and says, no, man is naturally a political creature, meaning that it is crucial to our humanity that we express ideas, not only of pleasure and pain, which social animals can do. They can express pleasure and pain, but also to express ideas of things like expedience, justice, good and evil. In other words, there is a moral dimension to humanity which is most fully developed with others. Morality and politics are naturally closely linked, and politics develops naturally, according to Aristotle. He doesn't conceive of it as a social contract. He conceives of it as a natural growth, meaning that human beings left to their own devices will develop along these lines. Even if civilization as we know it failed, but humanity survived, the surviving humans would eventually build cities again, which is in fact what we see historically. If you look at what happened after the Bronze Age collapse, there are two natural relationships upon which the city or state is built. In other words, there are two natural relationships that are foundations of politics. And those two natural relationships are male and female, ruler and ruled. So even in the family, there is male and female, and that is for Aristotle a complementary pairing for the sake of procreation. And then there is the ruler and ruled relationship. Aristotle says archon and archomenon, and those are active and passive forms related to the idea of rule. One rules, one is ruled. Now, when you read an ancient text like Aristotle, you have to see the abstract rule as expressed. He is saying that complementarity, or a kind of equality, is needed, but also hierarchy is needed for politics. And this is going to be crucial because that dichotomy between equality and hierarchy is going to be visible in politics at all times and at all levels. And it is at the heart of the political alternatives which I discuss in this video. In Book 1, when Aristotle introduces these two natural relationships, he insists that they are not reducible one to the other. So you can't say that, well, the male-female relationship is a master-slave relationship. He doesn't believe that. It's a different kind of relationship. Those two things exist everywhere, and they exist in the family, and they exist by extension in every state, because the state is built upon families associating together. So those two elements are equality or complementarity and hierarchy. And by the way, a sign that these two elements exist in the family can be seen that husband and wife are equal in the sense that both are needed, and they can be seen as complementary in that ordinarily there will be a division of labor in the household, but there will also be hierarchy in the sense that parents will rule and children be ruled. And in traditional relationships, the husband will also be in charge to some degree of the family. And in fact, the example of parents ruling children for the benefit, for mutual benefit of the whole family, but also for the benefit of the children, that is one of the example models of properly functioning government for Aristotle. In a proper government, the rulers rule for mutual benefit or also for the benefit of the ruled, as parents do their children. We instinctively recognize this. A father who did things that disadvantaged his own son while advantaging himself, we would immediately recognize such a person to be a horrible person. And so on in politics. A ruler who ruled for his own advantage rather than the advantage of all, the common interest, that's a bad ruler. And in fact, a government that did this would be a bad government. Now, how do the two elements of hierarchy and complementarity, how do these emerge in political government? Well, that takes us to Book 3, which is what I'll look at here. So Book 3 is when Aristotle first discusses the different political arrangements and the ways that they are justified or justifiable. In Part 6, he says, first, let us consider what is the purpose of a state and how many forms of government there are by which human society is regulated. We have already said in the first part of this treatise, when discussing household management and the rule of a master, that man is by nature a political animal, and therefore men, even when they do not require one another's help, desire to live together, not but that they are also brought together by their common interests, in proportion as they severally attain to any measure of well-being. This is certainly the chief end, both of individuals and of states, and also for the sake of mere life, in which there is possibly some noble element, so long as the evils of existence do not greatly overbalance the good. Mankind meet together and maintain the political community. So this last part is, I think, a good way of looking at political community. When the evils of existence are not greatly overbalancing, political society can aim at noble goals. Now, if there exists a situation such as civil war or a famine or a natural disaster, then people will have to band together for the sake of mere life, as he puts it. They will have to deal with the evils of existence. That happens in extreme circumstances. But when those extreme circumstances are resolved, then people will again look to their higher goals. There's an example of this kind of behavior that you can see in Mexico City after the 2017 earthquake. There were communities in that city where people banded together independent of any central direction, and they helped one another clean up, they provided mutual assistance, and they tried to reestablish normal ways of life. They naturally and instinctually did what Aristotle describes here. Later he says, when the state is framed upon the principle of equality and likeness, the citizens think that they ought to hold office by turns. A state framed upon the principle of equality and likeness, that's a democracy or any form of democracy, including a republic, as we now think of it. The holding office by turns was something that happened in Greek-style democracy, where many political offices would be held by citizens on a rotating basis. But one could also say that this holding of office by turns is also a form of the circulation of elites, which is a later theory of politics, but I think it's a theory that Aristotle seems to have some concept of as well. And he goes on to say, formerly, as is natural, everyone would take his turn of service, And then again, somebody else would look after his interest just as he, while in office, had looked after theirs. But nowadays, for the sake of the advantage which is to be gained from the public revenues and from office, men want to be always in office. One might imagine that the rulers, being sickly, were only kept in health while they continued in office. In that case, we may be sure they would be hunting after places. So he's almost making a joke here, saying that it seems as if people feel they're only healthy when they have been elected to the Senate. They are only healthy when they're doing something political. And because of that, there's no circulation of elites. This leads to problems. Now, this might make a little bit more sense in a modern context if you take a broad sense of what constitutes an office. Even in Athens, Aristotle has to point out that offices are not always some elected thing. He describes various cultural and religious institutions, and he says these are also offices. And I think that in a modern context, a position in a think tank, some positions in academia, many people who work in NGOs or in media, even in corporations, these actually operate similarly to political offices, and in fact are equivalent in their meaning and their impact to elected offices. Now, my proof of this is that people can move laterally among these kind of positions. An example would be Nick Clegg moving from head of a British political party to a powerful position at Facebook. Or take the example of Google co-founder Eric Schmidt. Now, in addition to his corporate position at Google Alphabet, Schmidt has been chair of an advisory board to the U.S. Department of Defense. He's on the board of trustees at Carnegie Mellon and Princeton, two very prestigious universities. He taught at Stanford. He was chairman of a major think tank. I could go on, but the point is that even though he was never elected to any of these positions, he nevertheless has very influential positions. He just moves from office to office and clearly has an enormous amount of cultural and political influence. That's because all of these, I think, are offices. They all work like political offices. All these various institutions play roles in the governance of the American state. It all works together. And these people never leave office in the sense that they are always, throughout their careers, involved in something that impacts political life. Check on what Tony Blair has done in his career since he served as British Prime Minister. He's another example. To return to Aristotle, the conclusion is evident that governments which have a regard to the common interest are constituted in accordance with strict principles of justice and are therefore true forms, but those which regard only the interest of the rulers are all defective and perverted forms, for they are despotic, whereas a state is a community of free men. Now, we should bear in mind that Aristotle is talking about abstract categories rather than describing existing states. His abstract categories are true forms, which are royalty, monarchy, the rule of a one, aristocracy, the rule of the few, and constitutional government, rule of the many. And then there's defective forms, tyranny, rule of one, but rule in his own interest. Oligarchy, rule of the few, but rule in their own interest. And then democracy, which actually is the name he gives to the perverted form of constitutional government. The rule of the many, but in the interest of the poor rather than the interest of the common good. It's only in a completely dystopian situation that the rulers would have absolutely no regard to the common interest. Actual states probably exist somewhere on a continuum between rule for the common good and rule in their own interest. Aristotle's helmsman example that he gives in this book is probably an example of why. Because the helmsman of a ship can't really guide the ship solely in his own interest. Because if the ship goes down, then he dies. And similarly with the state. If the state fails, then the rulers will also go down. So to some degree, there has to be some attention to the common interest. Now, the modern situation can become particularly interesting in this because the ruling elites will not necessarily go down if the state goes down. And they seem to see themselves as part of an international community or wider body than the nations that they govern. And so there might be a sense in which they can lean more severely towards the perverted form of government, i.e. ruling in their own interest, than states in Aristotle's time could really be capable of. Although there were tyrants in Aristotle's time, or that Aristotle knew of, who certainly ruled in their own interest, and their states suffered as a result. Anyway, think of it this way, that most actual states exist actually on a continuum between true and perverted forms. In part 8, he raises the idea that, okay, we think of the distinction among states as the few, the many, and the one. What's the distinction between the few and the many? What makes them distinct? Is it that they're wealthy, the few are wealthy, and the many are poor? But what if the many in a state happen to be rich? Then what? So he has to get at, well, actually what it is it's not the number of them, but it's the claims they make. The claims they make to what is justice and why they should rule. That's the real distinction between the different forms of government. And so let's take a look at part 9. So part 9, he says, let us begin by considering the common definitions of oligarchy and democracy, and what is justice, oligarchical and democratical. For all men cling to justice of some kind, but their conceptions are imperfect, and they do not express the whole idea. For example, justice is thought by them to be and is equality, not, however, for all, but only for equals. And inequality is thought to be and is justice. Neither is this for all, but only for unequals. So there is no such thing as absolute equality. Remember that equality, but also hierarchy, were fundamental to the political situation. And people are different. There will always be ruler and ruled, better and worse. And so there will always be unequals in a society. So his conception of justice is that you give to each what is his due. You give equal things to equal people. To unequals, you give unequal things. And let's look ahead at part 12, where Aristotle addresses, okay, well, what is the common interest in which these people should rule? What are the claims they start to make? He develops this idea of what men think about equality a little further. All men think justice to be a sort of equality, and to a certain extent they agree in the philosophical distinctions which have been laid down by us about ethics, for they admit that justice is a thing and has a relation to persons, and that equals ought to have equality. But there still remains a question: inequality or inequality of what? He gives examples of, is it equality of wealth? Is it equality of land? Is it equality of food? Is it equality of power? Equality of what? And he goes on, for here is a difficulty which calls for political speculation. For very likely, some persons will say that offices of state ought to be unequally distributed according to superior excellence in whatever respect of the citizen, although there is no other difference between him and the rest of the community, for that those who differ in any one respect have different rights and claims. So here's the other thing. There's equality, and then there's excellence. And those actually end up being the two main claims to rule. And the answer to, well, how are we going to decide is, what's the goal of the state? So Aristotle gives an example. The best flute player should be given the best flute, regardless of wealth, regardless of nobility, regardless of complexion. That doesn't matter. Who's the best flute player? And it turns out that many things are needed for a state to obtain the good life. You need to have wealth, you need freedom, you need justice, you need courage. And also, supremely, men need to be educated and virtuous. They need to know what the virtues are, they need to understand, and they need to be able to practice the virtues. So in part 11, he goes on to say, the principle that the multitude ought to be supreme rather than the few best is one that is maintained, and though not free from difficulty, yet seems to contain an element of truth. For the many, of whom each individual is but an ordinary person, when they meet together, may very likely be better than the few good, if regarded not individually, but collectively, just as a feast to which many contribute is better than a dinner provided out of a single purse. For each individual among the many has a share of virtue and prudence, and when they meet together, they become in a manner one man, who has many feet and hands and senses. That is a figure of their mind disposition. Hence the many are better judges than a single man of music and poetry, for some understand one part and some another, and among them they understand the whole. So that's one way in which the democratic claim the claim of equality can be seen as true. There are matters in which the many can judge better. On the other hand, let's go further. There is a similar combination of qualities in good men, in the excellent, in the best, who differ from any individual of the many, as the beautiful are said to differ from those who are not beautiful, and works of art from realities, because in them the scattered elements are combined, although if taken separately, the eye of one person or some other feature in another person would be fairer than in the picture. Whether this principle can apply to every democracy and to all bodies of men is not clear. Okay, so there are other issues in which a few excellent are going to be better deciders of things than the collective judgment of the many. So the issue is whether political issues can be decided collectively or by the few who know, let's say, by experts. Well, let's look at some examples. One example would be through prices. Many people exercising their individual choice in a free market will do a better and clearer job of establishing prices than a small group of even extremely educated and intelligent experts. In other words, the example of the few collectively deciding things, one man seeing one thing, one man seeing another, and all together getting a picture of the whole. With prices, yes, that principle is correct, and that the few, even if they're extremely educated, they're not going to do a good job. So the Soviet Union tried that latter model, and it didn't work. It certainly didn't work as well. Now, I'm not going to go on and extol the virtues of free market capitalism here, but this is an example where the democratic principle, rather than the aristocratic principle, is a better judge. A counter to this would be generalship. A mass of soldiers acting collectively are not going to be successful on the battlefield, certainly not when opposed to a force where a general sees how to dispose of his men and directs them where and when to move, where and when to attack. And the men obey. So in generalship and in military matters generally, the aristocratic principle is better. So these two examples show the problem of resolving this issue completely, because political affairs are composite. Some things in politics are like prices, which are best decided collectively, which are best decided according to the democratic principle. But other things are like warfare, and they are best decided hierarchically. They are best decided according to the aristocratic principle. And we cannot reduce all things to one kind of thing or the other kind. Just as we couldn't reduce the two fundamental relationships to male-female or ruler-ruled, we can't reduce all things that are under political deliberation to democratic things or aristocratic things. Both exist and will always exist. And those become our real political alternatives. And in fact, this suggests that in any government, there will be elements of both sides. For example, even in democracies which champion equality, there will still be a hierarchical and aristocratic element, because excellence sometimes must rule the day. And even in aristocracies, there will still be a democratic element, because equality must still be considered. And I would argue that this is, in fact, what one sees in reality. However one defines your state, you will always be able to point to elements in that state that seem to represent the other principle. There will always be some elements in the democracy where you'll say, that seems oligarchical or aristocratic. That's always going to be the case, and vice versa with aristocracies. Even American Democrats who insist upon the equality of persons and champion advancing the equal rights of all, they will still call upon people to listen to the advice of experts. They will still overvalue the opinions of people who attend elite institutions, such as Harvard or Yale. In other words, they will still recognize claims of excellence. And in fact, political disputes among men are typically disputes over issues of equality, or they are disputes over competing claims of equality and excellence. Let me give a modern example of each kind of dispute. First, the rage for equity that we see now. That is a dispute over issues of equality, and it may be reduced to Aristotle's view that justice requires giving equal to equals and unequal to unequals, because the issue of equity proceeds from the claim that certain persons or groups, usually groups, are unequal. They are disadvantaged in society due to historic and systemic oppression, and that therefore such groups must be given advantages, i.e., they must receive unequal treatment to obtain equal outcomes. So you must give unequal to unequals. The counterarguments, such as they are, because few seem to have the courage to raise a counterargument, but the counterarguments, such as they are, will often center on the question of whether equal outcomes can and should be mandated by the government, or whether unequal outcomes may be the result of factors other than oppression. This is a dispute over equality. My second example is an example I heard discussed on detail on another channel. There was a popular media convention some years ago where the head of DC Comics was giving a speech, and he was heckled by a woman in the audience who demanded that DC Comics hire more women. She was making a case for equality. The numbers of men and women hired by DC were not equal. And his reply to her was that DC Comics, quote, hired the best artists and writers, end quote. This was clearly a defense on the grounds of excellence. And she in turn replied, but some of the best artists and writers are women. This was rhetorically effective because it admitted the claim of excellence while still suggesting that attention to equality should be paid. Now, while this example was not of massive political importance, it does illustrate the fundamental division which is now playing out in society and which has critical ramifications. And it's a dispute between equality and excellence. The implication, though, is that all groups, if not all individuals, are equal, and therefore their outcomes should be equal in society. The idea being that, on average, each group should be essentially equal to other groups. But there is no reason why one group should be equal to another group any more than one individual should be equal to an individual. To say this is politically dangerous, because to insult an individual is not costly, but to insult a group, particularly if that group is politically organized, well, that can be career-ending. Two implications for politics are that one should not, even in a democracy, be afraid to make a case on the basis of excellence. Merely raising the idea of equality or equity does not automatically mean that further equality is always a good thing, because excellence always has a claim. It is the nature of democracies, however, to always become more themselves, that is, to demand further and further equality and even to attempt to unseat excellence from its rightful places. A second implication is that courage is always necessary in political disputes. As Aristotle says in Part 12, without justice and courage, a state cannot exist well. One further note, an Aristotelian analysis of the current situation might go something like this. Liberal democracies have inculcated a severe partisanship on behalf of equality, one that neglects or denies claims of excellence to an almost absurd degree. So some people will actually suggest that all the differences between people and groups are created by oppression. There is just natural equality, absolute equality. And in addition, the leadership in modern liberal democracies has wrongly taken the view that the good that the state pursues is in some critical sense a global and not a national good. Now here, I want to point out that Aristotle suggests that globalism is not a real thing. It's not a true goal. As he points out in the central passage of Book 3, Part 9, suppose distinct places, such as Corinth and Megara, to be brought together so that their walls touched. Still, they would not be one city, not even if the citizens had the right to intermarry, which is one of the rights peculiarly characteristic of states. And he goes on to say, if they have nothing in common but exchange, alliance, and the like, that would not constitute a state, which is a community of families and aggregations of families in well-being for the sake of a perfect and self-sufficing life. Globalist politicians imagine that we can do this. We can take not only Corinth and Megara, but we can take Africa and put it into Europe and make one city. Or we could take the Middle East and put it into Europe and make one city. Aristotle was skeptical that even Corinth and Megara could be made one city. Now, I leave it to the viewer to consider who will be proven correct.